Okay, welcome to another unscripted SaaS TV episode. I'm here with Dan Webb, who's an engineering manager at Twitter in the web core team, and we just had a couple of beers, but we've been talking about the future and present of JavaScript, and my understanding from talking to Dan, who spends a lot of time thinking about these things, is that there's now a community of people that's taking JavaScript in a slightly different direction for web-based SaaS than it used to be. So tell us about those people. What are they up to?
So there's certainly a sort of fairly new, probably a year or two old movement, which is basically towards the browser as a kind of like a thick client, and the server just presenting a JSON API.
So basically the server is just handing you back data structures, and all of the logic, the rendering, model view controller, all that stuff, there's people advocating to push all of that into the browser and to do it in JavaScript.
Yeah, essentially. It's there are a few sort of reasons to do it. The main sort of cited reason is responsiveness. If we're delivering smaller amounts of data over the wire, then you can get that to the user more quickly.
So it seems to me that, with all due respect to that argument, one of the advantages that people discovered when they started doing software as a service is you control the whole stack. So you control the hardware, the software, you can put a lot of effort into tuning, and the tuning will actually work. Aren't you giving up a lot of that if you now are delegating a lot of the work back to each individual user's browser? And they have all different computers, and who knows if they have malware installed or...
Sure. That's been the biggest problem with the architecture that we've seen at Twitter. We've certainly identified real problems there where the top... the slowest 5% of our users were seeing speeds of around 8 seconds before they actually saw the first tweet on their home timeline.
Well, even though you were delivering the sort of, enough bytes to render the page much quicker than that.
Yeah, so we would render a relatively small amount, send a relatively small amount of HTML, but then on top of that you need to send the style sheets, you need to send some JavaScript, and then the JavaScript has to parse, execute, fetch the timeline data, then execute more JavaScript to actually render that home timeline. So you have this really long startup time there.
So I guess in this case, it sounds like what happened is you essentially had to give up some part of the control you would have had over the user experience, and the result is that some users actually ended up having a much worse experience than they might otherwise have had?
Certainly. I mean, it's nice as a business to be able to think that you can, if you need to spend money, if you need to spend engineering effort, that you can fix an experience across the board, or at least have a kind of a constant improvement for all of our users. In that environment, there was just some users that we couldn't really help, aside from going and buying them a new laptop.
So
which is
there something that your team is working on now to sort of revamp the way the site is architected that would be more, hopefully a more permanent fix here?
Sure, yeah. We're actually doing a major re-architecture to pull a lot more of the work, especially the rendering of markup, back onto the server. So we're going to be rendering all of our pages in reasonable fidelity on the server, sending it in the initial HTML, and then kind of decorating it and adding extra functionality with JavaScript on top as a layer. So more what people would term progressive enhancement.
So the other thing, when we were talking before, I was struck that you mentioned another challenge in doing heavy JavaScript in the browser is unit testing. Can you say a few words about that and what your experience has been with that?
Sure. We're actually working on some really interesting ways to fix this problem. But traditionally, the problem has always been that browser JavaScript, its main job is to listen for events from the user, interpret them into some kind of action, which is normally changing state on the DOM, accessing the network to get some data, and then updating the DOM. And there's nothing you can really test as a unit there. So the traditional thing to do is use something like Selenium or WebDriver, which actually presses buttons and
it's kind of expensive, though, in terms of time taken to run those tests.
Sure. Any benefits that you might have of mocking are gone because you're actually exercising the entire stack and waiting for network calls to happen. And it's a slow process and it's a fragile process because normally if you change the higher level your tests are, the more brittle they are.
So it's at the risk of putting words in your mouth, it sounds like at the moment you're still more on the side of for a better customer experience, it's better to let the server do what the server does best and maybe not put all those eggs in one JavaScript basket. That's the beer talking.
Yes. Yeah. Although that being said, I think there are always trade-offs, and you need to know what the upsides and downsides of each design decision you're making are, and what's best for your user and what's best for the thing that you're building. There are ways around various of these issues, but yeah, I think for a mainstream website that wants to have a good experience for all of their users, then you should certainly think about putting more stuff on the server.
Cool. Well, thanks very much. This has been Dan Webb from Twitter, and thank you for watching SaaS TV.